Oh, perfect. There we are. Okay, now we're recording. Missed a little bit in the beginning there. It was paused. Sorry about that. Just go back. Perfect. Okay. So yes, it's recording now. Okay, perfect. So yeah, we kind of went over all of those different parts of the background info part of the application. And again, family information includes things like number of siblings, parents, and income, things like that. So onto the coursework and official transcripts part of your application. So they will calculate your GPA and your quote unquote science GPA for you. And so you don't really have to do that on your own. Of course, a lot of you will, sort of just to see where you are even prior to that. But it will be automatically generated for you after you input all of your classes and their respective category, like Physics 101, physics as a category, and then units and all that. After that, when you actually submit your application and you get the primary transcript back, it'll have that GPA calculated for you. And then official transcripts take a while to get processed, to be received first and also processed by AMC. And it says it will take 15 business days to process or 25 business days to process by mail. If it's electronic, 15, by mail, 25. So I would recommend getting those in as soon as possible. I mean, yeah, this is the earliest, the sooner you can get it in, the better. I mean, it can only help you to not risk it getting delayed at all. So I would make sure to also check with the schools that you're applying to, and make sure to not apply to them if you don't have those particular classes that they require. And again, we've gone over that before in the last lecture, but MSAR is a great resource to look at individual schools and their requirements to figure out what schools you should apply to. But again, all of this really is pretty logistical stuff. I think as long as you can keep that the transcripts and letters of rec in mind, the rest really is like a sit down coffee and input kind of thing. And also it takes about 6 to 8 weeks to actually process your application once you submit it. So, and we'll get into that, but submitting it as soon as possible is also very helpful to get the ball rolling, given it is a rolling admissions based system. So the next part, which is finally the first part that requires a lot more time relative to the background info and the courses. So what is the personal statement? This is a about a 1-page single-spaced, or 5,300 characters if anyone has a reference with what that means, but it's about 1 page essay where you answer this prompt. Use the space provided to explain why you want to go to medical school. And that might seem easy at first, but I mean, as you can imagine, I'm sure the second you read that simple, very simple prompt, you wonder, damn, that's pretty simple and pretty vague, I guess is a better word. So this is where a lot of your time, as well as the work and activities, get spent. And if you're applying to the MDPhD program, you need to complete 2 additional essays, the MDPhD essay and the significant research experience essay. So for this topic, which we're going to get into in the next couple of slides, is one of the most important. And yeah, I think proofreading carefully also when you do actually submit it, or most of you are going to write it in a Google Docs or Word and then copy and paste it. When you copy and paste it, don't forget that unlike Word, it doesn't have a spell checker. It's just one of those blank text boxes. So make sure you reread it once you actually copy and paste it into there. And just down there, we mentioned the typing in Word and Doc and then copying over. Formatting could change, so I would highly recommend rereading it within AMCAS, the application portal system itself, to make sure that the formatting and all that's good. So what makes a personal statement good? The first part is to answer the why and the how, not just the what. Don't get stuck in the cycle of, I did all these things because I want to be a doctor, and now I want to be a doctor because I did all these things. It's really easy to sort of fall into that trap of going, well, at this point, I kind of have to be a doctor, don't I? I mean, I did all these things. It's to really go back to the core reason of why you initially did all those things, why you initially even set out for this path. And everybody's path really is unique. And this is a chance to really highlight your path in an essay format, in a storytelling format. And then the second thing is to leave no doubt that this is the career for you, especially as you sort of conclude your essay or as you sort of tie things together towards the end. An example being, for no other career could fulfill my desire to direct care, employ my love for human progress and technology, and satisfy my need to assist in the well-being of others realistically. That's an example of someone making a very confident statement that no other career could fulfill that all those following things. And that's really important because You don't want to get stuck in that doubt, I guess that doubt place where people go, is this person really that dedicated to pursuing this long career? So this is a chance to sort of shine that confidence and to highlight it. And then don't distract the reader or waste your words. You don't want to talk so much about what happened, but rather how it changed you and sort of developed you as a person. You don't want to just you have a work and activity section that's coming up that we're gonna discuss soon that actually gets more into the specific activities you did. You definitely want to mention them in your primary, but you really want this to be a story, a sort of raw story of who you are and why you want to become a doctor. And then some red flags to avoid are some experiences that may sound really cool. This is a very important but a very nuanced topic, but you want to avoid talking about things that sound really cool, like being, you know, on a trip in a foreign country where you help deliver babies, or potentially be involved in a surgery that you might not necessarily, that you should not maybe necessarily haven't been involved in. That sound really cool, but you don't want to forget that there are ethical and sort of value-based principles that get a little murky in different places, and you don't want to bring that into, I guess, this system as you're applying. So you don't want to mention things like giving birth in other countries and helping people do that if it's out of your scope of practice. So I'd be careful with that. Things that sound really cool but aren't exactly right, if that makes sense. And then also answer the prompt in the first 5 sentences. You really want to get the ball rolling. You don't want to start off with like too heavy of a, it was once in an autumn, you know, autumn Monday or an autumn afternoon in the, you know, dew of the morning, or some like sort of really sort of cringy, I don't want to use the word cringy, but overly, you know, dramatized beginning for a whole paragraph. You want to kind of get to the point. And then don't overtly state that I want to help people. It's sort of implied, and also, you know, is one of going back to that sort of waste of words. You want to really discuss how you've developed to become a person that's going to help people, and how you've learned the importance of that, of the role of a physician, and et cetera, things like that. And then have a clear purpose. Don't mention other professions, and answer the why not another profession without actually answering the question. So you want to get into the, you want to describe eloquently and sort of naturally why you want to be a physician and not other medical professions without explicitly just saying that. And you can write about your experiences even though you have an activity section. That's kind of what I mentioned earlier. You don't want this to be a list of things that you did to get you up to this point, but you can definitely mention examples of how certain experiences that you're going to talk about later in more detail shaped you and sort of added to this main theme. I like to think about it kind of like your main mission. Not everyone plays video games, like a main mission and quests within that sort of storyline. This is your main mission. You can use those quests to help improve upon that story that you're telling and that journey that you're on. So in summary, you want to be honest. Your personal experience really is unique to you, even if you don't believe it. And I really want to emphasize that last part. A lot of people don't believe that they have a unique story, but it's literally true. Like your story is unique to you, and be confident in expressing your particular story. That's a really big thing. And then also, don't say that you want to go into medicine to help people. We mentioned that in the last slide, but it really is important that that should be implied and also emphasized and highlighted through your experiences, which are the things that you're sharing. You're not just sharing statements like, I want to help people. It should be implied after a good essay and a well-written essay. And then be specific. Why do you want to be a physician over other health professions? That's a big part of it. You really want to hone in this particular career in this role. So moving on to editing your personal statement and how to go about that process, you definitely want to start early. I think I mentioned this in my first talk a few months ago, but you can start as early as right now, no matter where you are in your process. There's no such thing as too early. The actual writing part might not be done, years in advance, but you want to start thinking of that initial question. Why do you want to be a physician? Or why do you want to attend medical school? You can think about that as early as you want. And I would say realistically, so going back to the real world, I would say months in advance, you could definitely start writing the personal statement or get a general bulleted sort of preview down. You want to plan ahead for review as well. You're definitely going to want to have a couple of eyes looking over this essay and this personal statement, and start early in planning who's going to be doing that. You want to be thinking of old teachers that you might have had that you are still in touch with. You want to get this out to them early, because you don't want to be that person who email somebody, hey, Mr. or Dr. or Mrs. X, do you mind reading this this personal statement of mine that's due in 2 days? You don't want to be that person. So I'd recommend planning that ahead, and then identify those people. They could be friends, it could be previous professors, it could be mentors you've had, it could be colleagues in a place you work, in a research lab, things like that. And find people that you trust. You don't want it to just be anybody. And then the don't let it impact your statement too much part is also huge. You don't want, you want to take everyone's advice with a grain of salt and sort of weigh each person's advice as they come, depending on your relationship with that person and how well they know you, as well as their background as to how good of a writer they are and things like that, and how much knowledge they have about it. And if your school has a writing center, mine unfortunately didn't, but if yours does, that's a great resource to utilize, a pre-med advisor or a writing center. And then talking to current medical students like us in an office hours setting is a great way to also get advice editing. I will say people sometimes may be hesitant to help with a personal statement because it is kind of a daunting investment. And I would ask nonetheless. Ask if people can review it, and I wouldn't be too upset or offended if people say that they don't have time or they can't, invest that. There's no harm that comes from asking, and I think you should ask as many people as you'd want to ask to get some advice on it. And then you can make different versions, but you don't have to. This is an important thing. I think you have different ways of writing, or you have different ideas of how you want this personal statement written. And in that case, you should go ahead and write them in multiple different ways, and people get a chance to look at those different versions and give you some feedback on a sort of trajectory that you want to go down, and get some advice on whether that's something that you want or don't want as part of your overall story. So moving on, so we just talked a little bit about our personal statement and that sort of main one-page essay. The next topic is going to be about your work and activity section. That's a whole separate section that you get to write about, in which you can put 15 of your work and activities experiences with a 700 character limit. And then of those 15, and I'm going to mention this later, but you don't have to write all. You don't have to put something in for all 15 slots. You can only have 12. You can only have 7. You can have whatever your story is, whatever your application entails. But of those up to 15 activity spots, you can choose 3 of them to be your most meaningful. And what you include in those work and activity prompts are the dates, the titles, your title in that position, the organization name. You have to add the time spent on doing that work and activity. Then you can mention your responsibilities and accomplishments, your impact, and the qualities that you gained and demonstrated. And that last thing, I think, is one really big part of this section, is demonstrating how you've changed. And just a tip: look back to your activities journal, which in my case was a Microsoft Excel doc where I just had everything that I've sort of done throughout college and things like that. Yeah, Amir, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, that 700 character limit, is that per activity that you can write about, or all 15 have to fall within that 700 character limit?
Oh, it's per activity.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, to make that clear. Yeah, it's per activity. And that's not including the most meaningful, by the way. The most meaningful has its own character limit, which we'll get into soon. Yeah, thanks for the question, man. Cool. And then here are the categories under which you can categorize each of those work and activities. So you have things like artistic endeavors, community service, volunteering, community service volunteering that's not medically related, conferences you've attended, and the whole list goes sort of going down this. The more popular ones often are research positions, like down on the bottom right, and community service volunteering. But also, if you've worked throughout college or before or after college, medical or not medical, you can put that. There's basically every possible category you can think of an activity that you did throughout your path before medical school. And here's an example of what an experience would look like. As you can see on the top left, your experience type, it's the thing that we just mentioned earlier. All of that categories, you need to put one of them. This one was leadership, not listed elsewhere. And the experience name, and then your contact email, of course, sort of redacted here. Then you have the experience description. This just sort of gives you a visual representation of how long it's going to be. It's really only a couple of sentences for the not most meaningful ones. There's not a lot of space to describe it, so you want to be pretty concise and get to the point, and really be direct with your sentences. It's not a personal statement where you get to sort of develop it and make it a little bit artistic. You want to make this pretty direct. And so here's an example of a full with most meaningful experience sort of mark on it. So again, of the 15 or less than 15 that experiences that you put down, 3 of them get to be chosen as most meaningful. So you can see from the top half, it's basically the exact same thing with an additional section that you get to emphasize why it was most meaningful for you. And this is where you can get a little bit more into that, I guess, personal statement, story developing aspect of it, where you really get into how you developed, how you changed, and why that experience was most meaningful for you. And the important thing is you still get that experience description on the top half. So you can still really mention like the crux of your activity, like the more concrete parts of it there, and then you utilize that space in the most meaningful to get into the deeper parts of that activity. And then here's an example of one of the shadowing option for shadowing doctors and how you input that. I know a lot of you have requested that we sort of talk about the difficult parts of the different processes of a medical school application. I actually found these little things to be one of the hardest in the primary application. Is like, how do I mention that I've shadowed? Like, do I put them all as an individual activity and like put the experience type all as community service volunteering and then, you know, organization names? I think the best way to save space in your 15 activities is to just do one activity that's shadowing physicians and medical volunteering, and then just list your shadowing experiences. You don't have to get too deep into each one about what you learned and what you did. In the case of shadowing, it's kind of nice to just have them all listed with the time frame next to them, the university, the person that you shadowed, and just a one sentence example of what you did with them and what you saw. And then going on to the most meaningful, you get 1,325 characters in addition to that 700 characters from the top to write about your most meaningful activities. And often you should have letters of recommendation from those most meaningful experiences. Not every single activity could naturally have a respective letter writer, but in theory, you should have a letter writer for if your most meaningful experience was research, for example. Your research PI or mentor should have a letter of rec for you in that sphere. But if it's, for example, being the president of a fraternity or sorority, a letter of recommendation is a little bit harder for those. Who do you really get it from? I guess maybe the advisor or something like that. But it's a bit more tricky with those. But I think volunteering and research are 2, and work are 3, where you really can get a good letter out of those, and you should if it's the most meaningful activity. And what you want to include in those most meaningful essays and prompts is everything you wrote about from your other activities, but also how you grew from that experience and what makes that experience stand out from the rest of them. It really is important that you get into why those are important for you, because going back to the whole painting a picture of who you are, what you select also for those 3 really highlights what your theme is. If research is not in one of those 3, it kind of indicates, if you did research and it's not in your top 3, it kind of indicates that you're not exactly research wasn't the most meaningful things for you. What was most meaningful was community service. It was volunteering. It was education. If you were like a teaching assistant or a learning assistant, one of those roles, that's what your theme is. If yours is research and like you also like wrote a chapter in a book and that's one of your 3, and it's obviously you're a very academic person and you really value that. So I think it highlights what your theme is in your application. And how to prepare beforehand for the work and activities. This really depends on where you are in the application cycle. Of course, if you're 2 months out from applying, it is what it is kind of thing, unless you take a sort of gap year and develop that. But the earlier you on, the more you want to think about this. Do what you're passionate about. I know that sounds really corny, but it's really true. You will be able to acquire more hours and write about it more meaningfully if you do what you really like to do. I know a friend who put his most meaningful as DJing of this top 3. He put DJing and he got the Geffen scholarship at UCLA, which is a full ride with a couple of thousand extra a month to live on. So you can put anything you want. And he was very passionate about that. In fact, his interview was about DJing. The interviewer asked him to play a song and he pulled out his phone and like showed him a mix he had made. So that was like a cool example of doing what you're passionate about. I had a friend who did archery and like that was one of his most meaningful. And then going with that, so follow your curiosity. Again, it really helps when you do something that you like, whenever it comes down to writing about it. It's so much easier than it sounding really like fake and cringy. And don't add fluff. Do not stress about finding other things to make sure you have 15 activities. I know I've sort of just from the way I've said it, I've implied that you need to have 15, and I really want to emphasize you don't have to have 15 activities. You don't. Most people probably don't. I don't know what the stat is, but you really don't need to have 15 activities. You could have anywhere from 3 to 15. So don't stress out too much about that. And do not participate and seek out opportunities to simply check the box. I think that one's definitely true as I look back on my experiences applying. But of course, when you're in it, you feel kind of like lied to, I guess, by people who tell you that. It's like, yeah, but you kind of do have to like check off, research and volunteering and all that. I'm gonna take a neutral ground here and going, there's a wisdom that comes from passing it and going, man, you really didn't have to have that. I promise you didn't. But I also understand that angst of like knowing that stats exist for a reason. X% of applicants had research, they had volunteering, and you feel like you have to too. So I understand that, but just know that following what you're passionate about really will help sort of guide your path. And if you're interested in medicine, it will lead you to the right way. I really reassure you that if you're early enough to manipulate that or change that in the process. And then what makes it good? Writing your experience as a story rather than a resume. Again, I've kind of been harping on this, but it really is true. You want to make it a story more than just a listing out of what you've done, hours and activities and things like that. So for example, and for research, if you're writing about research, don't spend the whole box describing the project. I promise you, a lot of people have really interesting projects, but the person reading your application doesn't necessarily care about the microtubular organization of rat cells in this species versus this species and how you compared them across time. It's more about what you learned in doing those projects, about how to be organized and how to stay on top of research and how to build your own Excel files, whatever your process was that you learned. Talking about that is what's important. And then certain activities to highlight. Activities that you engaged in for a long time are pretty important for a most meaningful experience. And activities that aren't likely to be in anyone else's application are super great too, like certain hobbies that are unique. Like my application, I did it for 5 years, but only 1 year while I was in college. But I mean, I did it for 5 years, like towards the end of high school and in my first 2 years of college. And that was Armenian like folk dancing. Like I did Armenian folk dance. I had like dance presentations and things like that. I had to like wear certain costumes. It's nothing medical, literally nothing medical, but I talked about it. And it came up in conversations in my interviews pretty often, so that's something that makes you stand out, fencing, reading, things like that. And then activities that demonstrate intentional pursuit. This really sort of goes back to the curiosity part of your theme and life. Like you want to highlight that you're a curious person who likes to learn, because that's a big part of medicine, is being curious and wanting to learn. And then lastly, you don't have to use all of the characters provided. This is also one of those, going back to the checking off boxes. It's really hard not to do in the moment because it's already so short. You feel like you really have to like go to the very end. But look, if you can get everything done in 50 characters less than the limit, that's it. Like that, if you feel like you've described it well enough, that's it. You can kind of stop there. And then here are the characteristics of a medical student. This is actually on the AAMC website for the competencies that are, I guess, that are sort of expected of incoming medical students and medical students themselves. And there's sort of 4 categories here. I'm not going to read them off, but you should be thinking about these as you develop your application. But they are kind of vague, like teamwork, written communication. Like they are vague, but they are a good framework by which you can think about what people in medicine are looking for in the next generation. This is kind of a good framework to look through. And then just to get into some other application systems, this entire time we've been talking about AMCAS or AMCAS, which is the biggest MD application system. There's also the TMDSAS, which is a Texas Medical School application system. This is if you want to apply to schools in Texas, you have to go through this system. AMCAS doesn't have any Texas schools on there. And it's very similar in a lot of ways, but it does have a few differences, such as the personal statement is 5,000 characters, which is a bit shorter than the AMCAS one, as we discussed earlier, and has 2 additional essays. And in those 2 additional essays, the second additional essay is optional, but optional, a lot of optional things in the process to applying to medical school or anything really academic often aren't that optional. But yeah, so this is just a bit of information about what they are. It's similar for the activities. You have a 300 characters for the regular ones and then 500 for the most meaningful ones. So it's a little bit different. They accept a 5-year-old MCAT, and they also have a match system, which is very similar to residency matching, if people are familiar with that. But basically schools and the students match their school, rank their schools based off of their order of preference. Like if I like Texas A&M more than I like, the other school in Texas that I can't think of, then I put that first, then second. And they do the same thing for me. Application one, number one goes first, whatever it is, and then a system matches you together. And there's a flat fee of $200 to apply to those medical schools, and they don't have a fee waiver, unfortunately. And then for the DO schools, if you're trying to apply DO to DO schools as well, there's a whole separate application for that. It's that really slightly longer acronym than the other two long acronyms. And the application opens up on May 4th. And it's similar but different again. It has a personal statement that's also 5,300 characters. And letter of recommendations are also necessary, but in this case, you really wanted to be thinking about getting a doctor of osteopathic letter of recommendation, a letter of rec. I'm not sure if some schools might require it, some schools might not, but it's very highly recommended that you do get one, of course, because it kind of highlights why you want to become a doctor of osteopathic medicine, and having a letter from a DO helps a lot. And your activities would be 600 characters, and the price for that is $197 for the first program and $48 for each additional one. And also, unfortunately, no fee waiver. And then the secondary is also pretty similar price range, $50 to $150. And then here's a little, I almost said infomercial, an infographic of the things that make a good work and activity section. And I'll sort of let everybody read through this when they get their, when they get the copy of these slides, but it kind of highlights everything we've talked about and what to highlight in the work and activity section, and your personal statement as well would be in this. Perfect. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to listen to the presentation. If you guys don't mind going ahead and filling out this exit survey, I'll leave this QR code up for everyone to do that. And if you guys have any questions, you guys can either type them in the chat, or go ahead and raise your hand, or just shout it out. Man, chats are so hard to see when you're sharing. There we go. You're sharing your screen. There we go. Yes, you can see the previous slide. Sorry. Can you see that? Come on. There we go. And for Barbara, yes, it is possible to access the previous presentations. I'm going to have a link once people get a chance to fill out the survey. Can we get the survey in the chat? Yeah, there we go. We have the link in the chat from Lauren. Thanks, Lauren, for the previous presentations. And they should be updated in the next few weeks. And the $200 Texas application cover all schools? I believe it does. I don't think there are that many schools to apply to in Texas, and I believe that does. I can confirm real quick. No, I didn't apply to any Texas schools. Ooh.
This doesn't relate directly to the primary application, but I know because of COVID, a lot of medical school interviews were over Zoom. Is that something that will be offered moving forward, or do you think it's going to go back to traveling to the schools?
That's a great question. I think that although a lot of people don't like the Zoom interview style because of the lack of, I guess, physical interaction, it does offer a lot of opportunity for students who are sort of economically disadvantaged, especially with like paying for flights and going out and things like that. So I think I have no confirmation. I'm not a dean of admissions, but I think it might be here to stay, or it might be an optional sort of option for people who are applying. I can't confidently say, but I have a feeling that it's going to be a lot more prevalent, virtual interviews, just because of the price savings and help for students.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, Amir.
Yeah, thanks. So I had no idea about how the work and activity section worked before this. And now that I have an idea of it, um, I guess, would you suggest then you can write out your descriptions and stuff before even AMCAS even opens?
Yeah,
And then just paste it in?
yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, exactly. You definitely can do that, and I'd recommend that you do that for sure. Again, you have quite a long time between when AMCAS opens up and when you can actually submit. In which case, you could write the work and activities for sure. I think the personal statement is something that you could also, as we talked about, spend a lot of time before it even opens up to write about. But I think the personal statement takes up a lot of time for sure.
Yeah.
And the most meaningful. I think I would focus on the primary essay. The primary essay and the most meaningfuls before it even opens up, because the actual work and activities, like, it really is pretty descriptive, so it isn't that hard. So yeah.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Just reading the chat over here on the other screen. Okay, perfect. Yeah, Olivia's answering some questions. Awesome. And then there's some questions in the next couple of slides. Everyone have this QR code, or if you need it, I can hold it here for a sec. Okay, cool. Because there's some questions in the next couple of slides that I want to get to. Let me just move this out of the way again. Okay, perfect. So here's some questions that we've gotten from the surveys. So for where can I find the Zoom recording after the session has ended? That link right there, which of course you can't click right now, but it's in the chat. I think Lauren pasted it a little bit earlier, so you can definitely access it through there, as well as the exit survey actually. Then how to write a great personal statement, how to phrase hardship. I think we sort of got into that a little bit, but I think the how to phrase hardship part is pretty important to touch on real quick. It can be hard to know what to describe as a hardship, and what sort of not to describe as a hardship. And I think talking to people that you trust that have some sense of what the medical application looks like an advisor or a mentor who is a physician, can help a lot about what's appropriate to mention, what's not appropriate to mention, and also how to phrase it. But I definitely think that you should think about phrasing hardships that you've had. You don't want to let hardships that have, made your path more challenging sort of left out. You want that in your application. You want people to know about that because it was an important part of your life. So that's that part. And then could you include travel time for your work experiences and hours? I've never actually really thought about this, even though I drove an hour to school and back, which I always thought about a lot. Like, how do I mention this in my application? Because it was a big part of it. But I think if it's a meaningful commute or a lot of time that you spent out like traveling, I think it's fair to mention that. If you drove an hour to go to a research lab because you were really passionate about working with that physician and that lab, that's an important thing to mention, in my opinion. So I think going ahead and mentioning that is pretty important. And then how many community service and shadowing hours should be on your application? If you had a business during undergrad, could you put that under your extracurricular section? So for that first part, how many community service and shadowing hours? I think Dr. Suhu mentioned this in our last session. There's no definite number on these things. There really isn't. I think the shadowing, looking back on it, I had very little shadowing, very little medical experience in general. But I think if I follow your curiosity and be sort of confident in reaching out to people, I would have had a lot of hours just from being interested. Like, I want to shadow a GI doc, email all the GI docs that you know in the area and sort of go shadow them, orthopedic surgeons or just any surgery. Curiosity will lead the way to that answer is all I can say. Do what you like doing. And the more you get of it, the better, I guess, from that curiosity and interest. And then if you had a business during undergrad, could you put that under the extracurricular section? Definitely. Yeah, definitely. If you had a small business or even a legit LLC, like a full-on corporate, like a actual official business, definitely mention that. I mean, I imagine you spend a lot of time on that, so you'd want to have that in your extracurricular section. And then when should one start working on their primary application when applying for medical school? Like we mentioned earlier, the primary and the most meaningful, and even the work and activity section should be, you can start that as soon as possible. You have all the information in advance. And then for the actual background information, like work income, like the coffee, music type of stuff, as soon as possible. I mean, it doesn't take that much time. So whenever you can get to it, I would get to it. That part isn't the hardest part, but as soon as possible for the primary and the most meaningful parts. And then estimated range of MCAT scores and GPA for students that get accepted. When is the best time to submit your primary application? If the GPA is not a competitive range, do you recommend to do a special master's or postbac? That's a pretty, there's a lot in that question for sure. But for the first part, estimated range, MCATs and GPAs, the MSAR website is an amazing place. It's a one-time yearly subscription. Just I would recommend getting that. But you can also Google a lot of this stuff and find it. That's all kind of it's out there on the internet, whether it's on MSAR or otherwise, to find that to find those ranges in GPAs, as well as AAMC. AAMC publishes their annual average MCAT and GPA for students that were accepted and all that, and that applied, things like that. So when is the best time to submit your primary application? As soon as possible. As soon as that that application opens up to be submitted, you should be submitting it. Ideally, of course, everyone has their own circumstances, and you should do it as early as possible. Is all I can say. And by the way, not just as early as possible, as early as it's ready as well. You don't want to submit it on the first day if you're like it's half baked and not thought out. You rather have a quality submission than a quick submission. But if you can have both, you should have both, I would say. So that's that. And then if the GPA is not in a competitive range, do you recommend doing a special master's or postbac? That's a really hard question. And I think even if Dr. Suhu was here, he'd have a hard time answering that as well. It's that's really a decision call based off of the rest of your application and your story coming into the process. If you're competitive, not just through your GPA and through your sort of life experiences, a GPA might not stop you. But if you're less competitive in that regard, then and your GPA is quite low, then you might want to consider doing a special master's or a postbac, definitely. And then lastly, how and where to take the MCAT if necessary, how to start searching for programs. We did have a talk on the MCAT as our last presentation, which again, you can find in the link that's in the chat, as well as on the slides. You can get that information, but how and where to take the MCAT. I'm not sure about the how part, but or what that means, but where to take the MCAT, you should probably find a testing center as close to you as possible, so it's a convenient drive that day. You guys are over here, by the way. I'm looking at the faces on the right side. As convenient as possible to take that, so it's not a stressful event. But I know that they do get booked up quickly often, so I would keep looking and try to find the closest center to you. How to start searching for programs. So we mentioned that earlier with the MSAR website, as well as just online stats and things like that, and mission statements and websites of the schools that you're interested in. You can look at those for some more information. And then again, once you guys do get these slides and the appendix at the end of it, you can learn a bit about the early decision program, as well as some resources for a lot of the things that we already discussed, such as what makes a good application and how to write your working activities and things like that. Cool. Any other questions? Check the chat real quick. Perfect. So if there's no other questions, you guys can feel free to head out whenever is good for you. But if you do have any more, I'll stick around for a few extra minutes to answer them.
Hey, Gary.
Yeah.
One question that's a bit off topic, but since the MDPhD was mentioned in relation to essays, I did have a curiosity about it. Would you say, from what you know, if people are ever going into an MD-PhD program planning on being clinicians, or if you're going into an MD-PhD program planning on a career that's strictly focused in research?
What was the first part of the question? I heard the last part for sure. The clinician versus research only.
Well, that was the main thing. Like when people apply for an MD-PhD program, if the career trajectory should be a plan to work only in research, or if people would ever do an MD PhD, but they're planning on being mainly a clinician?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I didn't apply MD PhD, of course, and I didn't really think about it too much before applying. But I will say, looking back on it, there's a reason that you're applying to MD PhD programs and not just a PhD program, right? In a certain like physiological science or a PhD in that. So I think definitely not hinting, highlighting that you want to have some clinical experience and sort of clinical practice in the future as well is a big part of why you're applying MD PhD. I think highlighting that I would probably shy away from. And again, please, anybody, Lauren or Flake or Olivia, if you guys want to chime in, I think I would sort of shy away from being too heavy on the I want to practice sort of science as an MD PhD only. Obviously, it's important because you're applying MD PhD for a reason, but just saying that you want to do science-based research and not a lot of clinical work, I would shy away from that, I think, a little bit.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I can actually chime in on that. And I heard this question come in. I'm sorry, I'm like keeping one ear on this while I'm like doing some other stuff with some people at my house. But so the way it was explained to me for CU's program, at least, and disclosure, I am also not an MD PhD student. But if you are doing a PhD, like you wouldn't apply to a PhD program anywhere else if you didn't intend on doing a heavy amount of research, right? So the way it was pitched to one of my really good friends who is one of our MD PhD students, or at CU, it's called MSTP. What he was told is that you want to think of it as like an 80-20 split. Like your intention for your career should be 80% research with like some emphasis on the clinic. And like, obviously that's kind of a soft number. Like some people do more or less of each, but the big thing there is like you are probably the way to think about it and frame it is at that point, you want to make sure that the medical part of your application matches what every other med student applicant is going to have. You want to have like just as much volunteering, just as much like clinical experience or like things that you can talk about in that, but you also need to have more research coming in on your application to kind of bolster like your claim to saying like, hey, I want to spend, 75-25 or 80-20 on research. And therefore I want to be considered for your MD PhD program, not just your MD program.
And I'm very happy actually Olivia chimed in and mentioned that 80-20 thing because my work as with my preceptor who was an MD PhD in pulmonology was literally an 80-20 split. He had clinic once a week. So I could only shadow him and work with him on Wednesday afternoons or Wednesdays for 8 hours. And he worked in research for 4 out of the 5 days of the work week. And then, weekends he had off. So that's a kind of an insight into an MD PhD's life right there. He had clinic once a week dealing with cystic fibrosis and different diseases as patients only. And then did research on cystic fibrosis in his other 4 days. So it's a really good split right there. It's a good like insight into what that career looks like and how to highlight it.
Gotcha. So in other words, you shouldn't plan on doing an MD PhD as a way to kind of fund med school if you could get in, if you're primarily planning on being a clinician. Like that's not a good plan from what I can tell.
Yeah.
Correct. And they will intentionally split the curriculum. So CU's program, they actually do, our year is a little bit different, but they're basically doing their first like clinical year. So clerkships, which again for us is a little bit skewed and this will change by school, but some schools will do like, oh, you do your first 2 classroom years and then you do your PhD in the middle. It's not like you do your MD and then the PhD afterwards and like split. And it's also worth pointing out that there are not at the schools that have MD PhD programs, they tend to be very small and they are very selective. And if you are only going at it from the funding aspect, they are able to sniff that out so quickly because they have incredible applicants with like huge publication lists going for those spots as well. So an MD PhD is not a way to fund an MD. If you want an MD, just apply for the MD. You're also, I would say your odds may be better just because there are more MD spots across the board. But if like clinical or even lab-based research as it relates to clinic is like really your passion, like, go for it. Like I considered it for a little bit and then realized I really wanted more like the clinical side. And there is a lot of clinical research just in a normal MD too. So it's not like as somebody who loves research, you're not signing off on like the possibility of doing that for the rest of your career. If you just do an MD, it basically just means that you don't have to do the same volume as an MD PhD does.
Thank you both. That makes sense.
Annabelle, I think to that question, I think you usually have to pick one or the other. And then what they'll ask you is, if we don't accept you for our MD PhD program, would you like to be considered for our regular MD program? I remember seeing that on a few applications. I don't know if that changes the timeline. So basically, like, let's say you go through the MD PhD program and you say like, yes, I would like to be considered for a regular MD. Depending on when that school does their selection process for their MD PhD program, you're like, let's say you apply for that. Let's say you don't get into the MD PhD program, but like that happened in November. And so your application may not hit the regular pool for that school until November, at which point it is like you're on the later end.
Yeah.
So it's hard to know. Most schools, like, I don't know if I would apply. Sorry, I'm like hiding in a room in my house. I don't know if I would like try to hedge my bets like that. The thing is, like, again, I love research and I am just in a normal MD program. I want to do research for the rest of my life. But the problem is I also really like people. And therefore, like, I would like to do both. I would like to have a lot of clinical time, and then research is the stuff that I'm curious about outside of that. I don't want my career to be research driven, which is why I am in med school. And I gave up the PhD dreams that I had before. I would say generally, like, if you're going to apply MD PhD, you better be really sure that's what you want. But also with the understanding that, like, even regular MD programs, like Gary and Falake know our classmate, like Gordon, Gordon's first application period, he actually applied to MD PhD programs and didn't get anywhere, but it's a small number of spots at every school that offers it. And they're very selective because they can be. And Gordon does a ton of neuro research now, just as a normal MD student, and is like an academic powerhouse because that's what he's passionate about. He's looking at taking like a research year, for example. So again, I wouldn't necessarily hedge your bets. If you want to apply MD PhD, like, you better know, kind of thing. But MDs do as much research. It just tends to look a little bit different.
Yeah. And Annabelle, I think you were also asking, like, if you sort of submit your primary application, could you, of the 30 schools you apply to, could you submit 20 of them as an MD and then 10 of them as an MD PhD? And I believe you can, right? Your primary? Yeah, you definitely can. So I think if that's what you're asking, you definitely can do that. And then just select, if you want to only apply to MD PhD at one school of your 30 and 29 regular MDs, you just check a box on that one school saying you also want to apply to the MD PhD, I believe, on the primary, and you just send it out that way.
Yeah, I remember, and I don't know if this is like super kosher advice, but like, I remember what I did the year before I thought I was ready to apply. I actually went through and like started filling out the AMCAS so that I could like navigate through the different pages, see what it asked for, and like get my character limits and figure out stuff like that. And that might be a good option to answer that question, is like, get all the way to the point where you can build a school list and like choose where you're going to send your application, but then you don't actually submit. Because if it's partial and if it's never submitted, the schools don't see it. But you know, if you don't want to submit it before you're ready. So just be really, really careful if you're going to click through the application to like learn more about it.
If I could ask another question on timing. Trying to get the timing of how everything works in my head. When you guys talked about before how secondary applications can be a really busy time for you, when it comes to flying out for interviews, let's say you have a decent little bit of time for that, or a decent bit of interviews that you have to do, is it sometimes difficult when you're either in school at the time, work, or in research, or whatever it would be, to plan those trips and get the time off from either school or work?
Yeah, I think it can be hard. I worked at the Apple Store in my like time off and my year off, and like it was kind of annoying having to like ask people to like cover my shifts for this day and then having to make it back with them like another day just to fly out for interviews. So it can be kind of annoying, but I think that's really, again, very unique to the person's story. If your gap year is off and you're doing nothing for the most part, then it's pretty easy. If you're like working a full-time job, it's really hard. If you're in school, it's pretty hard to, I imagine, right? Like even if you have an exam on the only interview slot day that exists, like how do you go to that interview and have to, you know, a lot of professors will be pretty or could be pretty lenient, but they could also not be. It can be stressful, but this is the time frame. I don't know if this helps at all, having this up, just so you can really just sit there and like let it marinate of where things are happening. And I think in that August to December range, like right now we're sort of the tail end of not tail end of interviews, but like we're in the, I guess, the 3/4 way, you know, February, March is kind of when they end officially. But yeah, this is kind of an idea of what it looks like. And your secondaries are, again, they kind of intermix, of course, because you can be submitting secondaries still and getting interviews in that August, September range. But again, you could be writing those secondaries well in advance. Like you could be writing them in January if you really wanted to, you know, they're all online and they don't usually change year to year. So yeah.
Thanks, Gary.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I would say generally like my bosses were pretty understanding when I needed to take time off, and they understood that like I didn't always have a good timeline for it. Usually it was with enough notice that like I didn't have an issue. I don't even want to say like getting coverage, but like I wasn't going to leave them short staffed. And I always had enough time to like, if it did fall on a weekend or I was going to have to travel and miss like a scheduled work day instead of a day that I just had to show up and see. I taught snowboarding, so it was always like iffy on would I actually get work that day. But like for the assigned days where I knew I had like a locals group or something, like I always had enough of a notice where I could find somebody to cover. And I was pretty clear with my bosses that it was like, hey, like this is my one chance. I don't get to reschedule this interview. And if it comes down, like as awful as it sounds, if it comes down to like me making this interview or like teaching kids how to snowboard, I love my kids, I love my job, I love you guys, but it's gonna be the interview. But I don't think I've heard of anybody who is like made to choose, because like people get it. Like this is a huge dream for so many people. And a lot of people like actually like possibly even your bosses or your coworkers like get it. They might've given something like this up and they're like, no, man, do it. Like go for it. Like we will make it work for you. And you'll find that a lot of people are very supportive. So yeah. I think you'll be fine.
Yeah. People are more supportive than you think, especially when they're managers of like a place like that. They understand, like they want their employees to achieve their dreams as well. Like whatever they're like, at least my manager was the Apple Store of all places. Medical is nothing related, but he was like, yeah, man, you want to be a doctor? Like go to your interview. Like you can, it's fine. Like you're going to be quitting in like 5 months anyways. So just go for it. But yeah. Any other questions? By the way, we also have an office hours tomorrow from 6 to 7. I'm in LA time, 6 to 7 Mountain Standard Time, my time 5 to 6. Yes. So if there's any last minute questions for today, we can go ahead and answer them, but we also have tomorrow for a pretty open discussion.
Yeah, and I think if I could be wrong, but that one is not being recorded.
Yes. Yeah.
Off the record. Yeah. So, I mean, it'll be casual and like you can kind of ask anything. So yeah. It'll be cool.
All right. I'm going to stop on that same note. I'm just go ahead and stop recording.